You are a sailor aboard Leif Erikson's ship, somewhere in the freezing waters west of Greenland. Weeks now, since you lost sight of land. The food is running low. The wind has turned bitter. Half the crew has stopped talking, saving their strength for rowing instead. Leif stands at the prow, same as he has every morning, scanning a horizon that never seems to change. You have heard the story, of course. A trader named Bjarni, blown off course years ago, who claims he saw land out here once. Green, forested, unlike anything back home. He never set foot on it, just looked and sailed on, too afraid or too tired to stop. Leif bought that story from him, bought his old ship too. And now, here you are, following a rumor across open ocean, with nothing but Bjarni's word that there is anything out here at all. Nobody on this ship has ever seen a shoreline that isn't Greenland or Iceland. Nobody knows what waits beyond the edge of the map they were raised on. Then, on the third week, someone shouts. A dark line on the horizon. Not ice, not fog. Land. The crew goes silent. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. Leif doesn't say anything. He just watches it grow larger, hour by hour, until the shape resolves into trees. Real trees. Thick and green, further than anyone has ever confirmed a European ship has traveled west. The boat scrapes against the shore. For a moment, nobody moves. Every sailor who has ever heard Bjarni's story wondered if it was real. You are about to find out. Leif steps off the ship first. His boots sink into ground no one from your world has ever stood on. He says nothing. He simply looks around, slowly, taking in the trees, the grass, the strange stillness of a land with no name yet in your language. Then he turns back toward the ship and gives the order to unload. What happens on the shore over the next few years will not be remembered by your people for very long, but it will not be entirely forgotten either. Not completely, not forever.
Before we get into what actually happened on that shore, if stories like this are the ones you want more of, hit subscribe. Now here is the story historians have pieced together about the first confirmed European voyage to North America, 500 years before Columbus ever set sail. His name was Leif Erikson, and according to Norse tradition, he was not even the first to see this land. That distinction likely belongs to a trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was blown off course around the year 985 while sailing toward his family's new home in Greenland. Bjarni spotted a forested coastline in the distance, unlike anything back home. But he never went ashore. He simply noted it, turned his ship, and continued on to Greenland, more interested in reaching his father than exploring the unknown. Here is what almost nobody realizes when they credit Leif Erikson with discovering America. He didn't stumble onto anything. He bought Bjarni's old ship, gathered a crew, and deliberately set out to find the land Bjarni had only glimpsed from a distance. Leif was the son of Erik the Red, and understanding the father tells you a lot about the son. Erik earned that nickname from his fiery red hair and an equally fiery temper. As a child, his own father had been exiled from Norway for manslaughter, forcing the family to flee to Iceland. History repeated itself. A deadly dispute with a neighbor left Erik responsible for several killings of his own, and he too was banished, this time from Iceland itself. With nowhere left to go, Erik sailed further west and found a rugged, partly ice-free landmass that no one had settled before. When he returned to Iceland to recruit colonists, he needed a name that would actually convince people to follow him into the unknown. So he called it Greenland, not because it was accurate, because it was persuasive. A handful of sheltered fjords really did turn green with grass in summer, just enough truth to make the name believable, and just enough exaggeration to make 24 ships of Icelandic families willing to risk everything on it. 25 ships set out in 985. Only 14 made it. Leif grew up in that settlement, in a family already defined by pushing past the edge of the known world, and by knowing exactly how to sell an idea nobody had proof of yet. None of this happened in isolation. By the time Leif was born, Norse sailors had already been pushing steadily westward for well over a century, driven largely by a simple, unglamorous problem: not enough farmland back home. Scandinavia's fjords and mountains left little room for a growing population, So Norse families kept sailing further out in search of somewhere new. They settled the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, and then, with Erik, Greenland itself. Vinland was simply the next logical step in a pattern that had already been repeating for generations, not some sudden isolated leap into the unknown. According to the Norse sagas, Leif's voyage took him past 3 distinct lands. First, a place of flat stones and glaciers he called Helluland. Then, a heavily forested coast he named Markland. And finally, further south, a land with wild grapes and mild winters that he called Vinland. Now, if you think that sounds like a simple, tidy journey, wait until you hear how much argument this has caused among historians for the last century. For a long time, Vinland was treated as little more than legend, a colorful detail added to a saga, the kind of embellishment oral storytelling tends to collect over 2 centuries before anyone ever wrote it down. That changed in 1960. Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad had spent years chasing a theory that Vinland wasn't myth at all. He sailed the eastern coast of North America, searching for any physical trace that matched the old descriptions, working his way up from New England, through Nova Scotia, and into Newfoundland. Here's the detail that almost never makes it into the story. The breakthrough didn't come from a research team or a university grant. It came from asking a local fisherman a simple question. Ingstad found himself in a small Newfoundland village and asked the residents whether there were any strange mounds or ridges nearby, anything unusual in the landscape. A local fisherman named George Decker said yes, and led him to a stretch of overgrown grassy bumps by the shore that the community had long called simply the Old Indian Camp. Nobody there had any idea what was actually buried underneath. Ingstad's wife, archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, spent the next 8 years leading an international excavation of that ground. What they uncovered rewrote the history of European contact with the Americas. The remains of 8 timber-framed buildings, an iron forge, rivets of the exact style used in Viking ships, a bronze cloakpin, and a spindle whorl, a small tool used for spinning wool, evidence that Norse women had lived here too, not just a raiding party of men. Leading experts at the time were skeptical. Many assumed it was simply an old indigenous settlement, nothing more. It took years of careful excavation to prove otherwise. Here's a strange twist. Almost nobody connects to this story. While Anne Stein Ingstad was quietly digging up real proof in a Newfoundland field, a completely different piece of evidence was making headlines. In the mid-1960s, a map surfaced showing what appeared to be a Norse depiction of Vinland, supposedly drawn around 1440, decades before Columbus. Yale University acquired it, bound together with a genuine medieval manuscript, and for a while, it was celebrated as the earliest known map of North America. It was a forgery. Scientists first raised doubts in the early 1970s when analysis of the ink revealed traces of a compound called anatase, a form of titanium dioxide that simply did not exist in ink before the 1920s. Decades of argument followed, with some scholars still clinging to the idea that it might be genuine. Yale finally settled the question for good in 2021, scanning the entire map and confirming that same modern titanium compound throughout every line, along with an inscription that had clearly been altered to make the map look older than it was. The real proof of Vinland was never a fancy parchment sitting in a rare book library. It was buried under grass in a field a fisherman had always called the Old Indian Camp, waiting for someone to actually dig. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed the excavated site at roughly the year 1000. For decades, that was as precise as anyone could get. Then, in 2021, that precision changed completely. Remember that empty stretch of ocean at the start of this story? The one nobody but Bjarni had crossed and returned from to tell the tale. Scientists found a way to look straight through 1,000 years of uncertainty, using something that had nothing to do with the Vikings at all. In the year 993, a massive solar storm blasted the Earth with cosmic radiation. leaving a chemical signature buried inside the growth ring of every tree alive that year, all over the planet. Researchers at the University of Groningen took wood samples excavated from Meadows decades earlier, samples bearing clear axe marks from metal tools no indigenous population in that region had at the time. By counting outward from that one radioactive tree ring in 993, they could count forward, ring by ring, to the exact year those trees were cut down. The answer, the year 1021, not around the year 1000, not sometime in this general era. The year 1021, pinpointed with a level of precision almost no other site from this period in world history can claim. This means Europeans were standing on North American soil, cutting down trees with iron axes, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus's ships ever left Spain. But the story of Vinland didn't end with Leif's landing. It got far more dangerous from there. According to the sagas, Leif's brother Thorvald led a second expedition, roughly 40 men strong, spending 3 winters using Leif's old camp as a base. On one of their explorations further along the coast, they encountered a group of Skrælings, the Norse term for the indigenous people they met. What happened next depends on which version of the sagas you read, but both agree on the outcome. A violent clash followed, and Thorvald was struck by an arrow. He died from the wound, becoming, as far as the sagas record, the first European to die anywhere in North America outside of Greenland. His crew buried him there and sailed home. The expeditions kept coming anyway. Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant, organized the largest attempt yet, bringing livestock, dozens of settlers, and the intention to actually stay. Among the settlers was Freydis, Leif, and Thorvald's sister, and by most accounts, just as fierce as either of her brothers. During one encounter with the Skrælings that turned hostile, the saga describes the Norse men beginning to retreat under attack. Freydis, heavily pregnant at the time, refused to run. She picked up a sword from a fallen companion, according to the account, bared her chest, and struck the blade against it while screaming at the attackers. Whether from shock or superstition, the Skrælings broke off the attack and fled. It is one of the strangest, most vivid scenes to survive from any Norse saga, and historians still can't fully explain why it worked. It wasn't enough to save the settlement, though, vastly outnumbered, far from any resupply, and increasingly unable to maintain peaceful relations with the people who already lived there. The Norse eventually abandoned Vinland for good. The camp at Meadows was likely never intended as a permanent colony to begin with, more a seasonal base for gathering timber and resources to bring back to resource-poor Greenland. Before the ending, though, something else reportedly happened here that deserves mention. According to the sagas, Gudrid, who traveled to Vinland on Karlsefni's expedition, gave birth to a son named Snorri. If the accounts are accurate, Snorri would be the first child of European descent, born anywhere in the Americas, nearly 5 centuries before that would happen again. Here's where honesty matters more than the dramatic headline. Leif Erikson did not discover an empty continent. Indigenous peoples had lived across North America for thousands of years before any Norse ship ever appeared on the horizon. What Leif did was something more specific, and arguably still remarkable. He led the first confirmed European expedition to deliberately reach, land on, and briefly settle a part of North America, 5 centuries before anyone in Western Europe had any real memory that Vikings had ever been there at all. As for Leif himself, he never went back. On the voyage home from Vinland, he rescued a shipwrecked crew stranded at sea, an act that earned him the nickname history remembers him by, Leif the Lucky. He returned to Greenland, and when Erik the Red died shortly after, Leif inherited his father's position as chieftain. He spent the rest of his life governing the settlement his father had built, not exploring the land he himself had found. It was his siblings, Thorvald and Freydis, and later Thorfinn Karlsefni, who went back to Vinland again and again, chasing something Leif apparently felt no need to chase a second time. The Greenland colonies Leif governed outlived Vinland by centuries, but not forever. Cut off from Europe, battered by a cooling climate, and increasingly isolated as trade routes shifted elsewhere, the Norse settlements in Greenland slowly faded. By some point in the 15th century, contact simply stopped. No dramatic final battle, no single recorded collapse. Just silence, and centuries later, archaeologists piecing together abandoned farms to figure out exactly when the last Norse Greenlander disappeared. The people who once sailed further west than anyone in Europe had ever gone eventually vanished from their own western outpost entirely. For centuries afterward, this story survived only as saga, half-believed, treated by many historians as folklore dressed up as history. It took a Norwegian explorer, a fisherman who happened to know his own coastline, and a wife willing to spend 8 years excavating an overgrown field to prove the sagas were describing something real. And it took 60 more years, and a solar storm from 1,000 years earlier, still locked inside the rings of long-dead trees, to tell us exactly which year it happened. Columbus's voyage in 1492 changed the world permanently, connecting 2 hemispheres in a way that never fully reversed. Leif Erikson's voyage did not do that. It came. It lasted a generation at most, and then it faded from memory. Outside a handful of Icelandic sagas, nobody outside Scandinavia read for centuries, but it happened first. 500 years earlier, a small crew stepped off a ship onto a shore no European had ever deliberately reached before, cut timber with iron axes that left marks archaeologists would find 1,000 years later, and then, eventually, left. Sometimes history isn't about who changed the world the most. Sometimes it's simply about who got there first, quietly, and left behind just enough evidence, buried in the rings of a tree, for someone 1,000 years later to finally prove it true.